Superhero video games, a cursed combination of words. You hear a lot about bad superhero video games all the time. The Superman 64s, Aquamans, and any of the many mid-Batman titles. But these are all DC comics. Despite its undeniably louder presence in the mainstream nowadays with the MCU, video games based off of Marvel comics generally seem to have a better reputation. Any old Google search for the best superhero games will throw endless Spiderman, X-Men, and MVCs at you. These days, Marvel, DC, and most superhero-related games are decent to great, but the 80s to the early 2010s were the Wild West. Time's forgotten a lot of these since licensed games are a dime a dozen, but this is what we're getting into today. We got LJN, we got Sega, and we got some awful Game Boy Advance ports. It's time for Bad Marvel games. So yo, it's Austin, and today I've compiled a bunch of these to talk about, all of which, of course, aren't good. But let's start way back, way before Disney bought them, way before the 90s X-Men cartoon, and even the Nintendo Entertainment System, we had Marvel games. Though I wouldn't necessarily use the word bad. Spider-Man, the Hulk, and the Fantastic Four all had video games on the Atari and old school computers, most of which being text-based adventure games. Is Spider-Man on the Atari 2600 a bad game? Nah, it's old. You probably wouldn't play this over, well, anything these days, but it's cool to know that the first Marvel video game is about the same age as good old Donkey Kong. Where's that crossover? There's also Howard the Duck. Yeah, Howard the Duck got himself a video game based off that movie, and it's about as good as you would expect. And don't forget about Spider-Man and Captain America and Doctor Doom's Revenge, the very first superhero crossover game. It's for the old school PCs, and it's a hybrid of an auto-scroller and a fighter. One where Spider-Man walks like he's playing Don't Wake Daddy. What about the Punisher for the Amiga? Or the Punisher's butt? A lot of these old games, they're just old. You can't really call them bad, because this is basically all you got back in the day. However, in 1989, after we'd gotten a taste of what a good video game could be with early NES and Master System stuffs, we'd get the first widely available console Marvel video game in the shape of the Uncanny XMen for the NES. Now, I love me some X-Men. From the 90s cartoon to Evolution, the comic books, and the ridiculously campy movies in the 2000s. That's a collective of super mutants I can get behind. Partially because my partner showed me a 30-slide PowerPoint on her favorite ship, Wolverine and Domino. X-Force sex and violence, anyone? This video game, though, just incites the violence part there.
This kid's crying. Do something.
I'm sure you may have noticed the LJN logo. YouTube gamers across the globe may recognize this little rainbow as the opposite of the Nintendo seal of quality, a publisher notorious for being one of the first major dealers of shovelware. The Uncanny XMen here didn't have a credited developer. It's speculated to be one of two different developers, but things are rough when no one wanted to take credit. Uncanny XMen is like an even rougher version of King's Knight. You pick two X people to play as, all of which have little bios for their character. Look, it's a little 5'3" Logan. But this game ain't cute. This is one of the hardest and most unforgiving things you can imagine. It's hard to explain, but this thing's controls and hit detection seem to be completely random. It's not as bad when you're playing Cyclops or Iceman, who have long-distance projectiles, but when you play as like Wolverine or any of the melee dudes, you do one of these. And will it work? I don't know. Roll the dice. That, and when you run out of health, which isn't displayed on the screen for some reason, you just die. Game over. Your AI companions are completely useless too. They're just kind of sitting in the corner and doing this. And although it's more than likely that the AI will just run into a trap, die instantly, and leave you alone to navigate this completely incomprehensible landscape of death. Or you could take a friend, but no one has that friend, the one who's gonna play Uncanny X-Men with you. Get real. But of course, this is LJN we're talking about. Now, they wouldn't go under it until 1995, but they would do a bunch of more damage to the Marvel name before then, with the exception of the Punisher for some reason. There's a lot, but there's two I want to mention specifically. For some reason, LJN got to publish a lot of Spider-Man video games, most of them being, well, unfortunate. So enter Bits Corporation, a British developer that worked heavily with LJN back in the day. They developed 7 different games for them, one of them being Spider-Man Return of the Sinister Six. Now, the Sinister Six are an awesome villain stable, and they get to shine real hard in Insomniac's Spider-Man. but not so much here. If you've ever wanted to like struggle to hit somebody as someone's struggling to throw a projectile at you, then maybe this game's for you. Bits made this and a lot of other things, but none of them were as bafflingly weird as Wolverine Adamantium Rage for the Genesis and SNES. Wolverine. Bruh. The 90s are an enigma. This came out in 94, a time when grunge music and punk should have been the obvious soundtrack here, but instead we got ourselves a Wolverine. Like the previous games, this is a run-of-the-mill platformer with unforgiving difficulty and extremely awful controls. Despite going from 2 buttons to 6, moving Wolverine around and attacking feels awkward and the hit detection is all over the place. You know, the LJN signature. Weirdly though, Logan is listed at 5'8" in this one. Unless Wolverine is Yamayugi and can grow several inches, then this guy's just lying about his height. Or like, perhaps the developers didn't care. It's probably that. Adamantium Rage actually sounds and looks pretty nice if you look past the stereotypical I'm in Japan music, but it's a clear sign that graphics aren't everything. A lot of older games got a pass on that since these things were reviewed as consumer products back in the day as opposed to like how it felt. And this doesn't feel good at all. It's pretty lengthy for a 2D platformer. It's got fun comic book sequences and by all means should have been a classic, but it's basically lost to time. Probably because it's one of those games where you have one life, it gets exponentially harder with every stage and you're gonna die a million times. And you know what that means. It's just not even a fun concept. Every level has you exploring the map in order to kill a set number of enemies before finding the exit with bosses thrown in sometimes. It's exciting, I know. Just don't play LJN games, but you probably already knew that. Generally, the 16-bit era was decent to Marvel properties, and I mean, there were stinkers, but none of them were like that stinky. Around this time, Marvel began licensing out to more prestigious companies. Sega and Capcom were releasing killer titles like the X-Men duology and, well, Marvel Superheroes, a fast and exciting fighting game that began a direct line into Marvel vs. Capcom, the golden era of fighters. But on the console side of things, it was the beginning of the third dimension, and if Superman 64 is anything to go off of, it was time for disappointment. I've got a trilogy of 64-bit games that I want to talk about today. 2 of them Acclaim and 1 of them Eidos. All 3 of them bad. It's bad Marvel games, what do you want? First up, and brace yourself, Iron Man and Exo Man of War in Heavy Metal for the PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn. Probably one of the worst video game names ever. 1996 was not a great year for Marvel. The comic book industry was in the middle of a huge oversaturation, and despite its resurgence in the 80s, it just wasn't enough, and they filed for bankruptcy. Turns out that comic books are indeed for nerds, and it would take the power of the film industry to turn them into the massive Disney-fueled success that they are today. But like the business at the time, the video games were also not great. Iron Man and Exo Man of War in Heavy Metal, I'm no longer gonna call it that, was the result of some big purchases leading to a weird crossover. We all know Iron Man at this point, but you probably don't know Exo Man of War. This dude's basically a space barbarian, and I mean, do you need anything else? You see his butt a lot, it's pretty cool. Man of War is not Marvel, but Valiant Comics, a company bought out by Acclaim Entertainment, who also bought LJN, by the way. I'm sure you can see where this is going. Well, in a rare case of intercompany crossovers, Iron Man and Man of War teamed up for this Acclaim-published video game developed by Real Time Associates, the group that brought us the legendary Bug. Well, Heavy Metal is right. Good old Bad Metal middies. Command & Conquer Red Alert, this is not. Heavy Metal is a bit of a Contra clone. You run and gun from screen to screen as either Man of War or Iron Man, knocking out dudes left and right. It's a very simple concept that's tried and true, but somehow they managed to make it rough. This game exudes Sega Saturn energy, but in all the wrong ways, not in the fun Dragon Force manner. The character models are sprites trying to look 3D, but they instead look like clay or even the Uncanny Valley. These ugly things just trek through all kinds of different dark environments and elevators that all look practically identical. Each time you beat a level, you get a password, and it's a very, very long password, and that's wild considering this is a PlayStation 1 and Saturn game that could have easily had save points. The interface is kind of gross to look at. It's sometimes tough to tell exactly where you gotta go. It's got Area 51 vibes, but none of the charm, as it's trying to play it straight 100% of the time. I think that with a few more months of development, this could have been pretty cool. It feels extremely half-baked, cracked and the forbidden door of comic crossovers happening was something that could have sold a bunch of copies if it was marketed properly, or if Marvel vs. DC wasn't also happening. I'm just not sure that Man of War is a cool, marketable, interesting, but I guess in the 90s, this guy was the bee's knees. There ended up being a 2-issue comic crossover, but nothing else came out of it. Let's just say it's no Godzilla vs. Barkley.
Next up, and also by Acclaim, the Fantastic Four for the PlayStation 1. Now, there's a lot of bad Fantastic Four games, pretty much any of which can fit in here, but I don't really see that one talked about a lot.
Growing up, I didn't really understand the reputation that Acclaim had. I just thought that Turok the Dinosaur Hunter and Extreme G were neat. I didn't realize that they were the licensed video game trash factory of the 90s, the game mill of yesterday. But now I'm here, 31 years old, playing Fantastic Four on the PS1 and truly understanding. This game is very similar to Heavy Metal in a lot of ways. It's a quickly produced side-scrolling 2.5D game, and I don't know about y'all, but it is impressive how anyone manages to mess up a 2D beat-em-up. Especially one based off of the Fantastic Four. It's practically built to be successful. This thing begins with a bunch of mini vignettes for each of the four with weird music and horrible CG. I mean amazing CG. Then we're given the Thing's massive forehead on the title screen. It's clobbering time for sure. But you know, only in this game can you do this.
Oh, look at that thick boy. Woo!
That's guarding, by the way. Mr. Fantastic has a bunch of really fun animations, but they kind of get drowned out due to the frustrating nature of this game. It starts out like a regular beat 'em up, but halfway through, things just start pounding the crap out of you. It's clearly meant to be played with 4 people in order to get through, but I feel like they didn't give a single player any leeway at all. But at least we've got a loading screen minigame, one that you won't nose over unless you see this very tiny text. But let's talk about the boss fights. At least I think they're boss fights. Ones that you can die on. You load into combat against what I assume is a boss, and if you're like me, get destroyed in a matter of seconds and then load into another level. Excuse me, what? Fantastic Four is really weird. A lot of the enemies look straight up cursed or like Clay Fighter rejects. Then you got others like this massive devil just hanging out in the mountains. There's a poorly explained mechanic where some enemies can only be hit by throwing others into them, into the background, but it's such a visual cluster that it's easy to mess it all up. But at least She-Hulk is a playable character. She looks great. I actually think she's kind of hot. I'm sorry.
Speaking of, well, kinda, there's one more PlayStation 1 that I want to get in today, and everybody say it with me. Marvel Comics, The Incredible Hulk, The Pantheon Saga, 16 syllables of power.
The Incredible Hulk was always a comic book character that I never really found myself that interested in. This time around, the license was tackled by Eidos and developer Attention to Detail Limited, who you're probably not familiar with. The biggest things they did were Lego Racers 2 and the Sydney 2000s Olympic video game. Pantheon Saga opens with some slow motion close-ups of Hulk doing Hulk things, but mostly just standing still because budget, y'all. But if you've ever wanted to see a 1996 attempt at CGI pores, here you go. I'm sure you noticed that right away. Yeah, this looks almost identical to the previous 2 games. It's pretty unfortunate, but all the Western developed Marvel games in the mid-90s suffered from same face, like Sword Art Online, but with ugly early 3D and Donkey Kong Country looking sprites. Same old butt rock, same old clunky controls, but this one has a lot more promise. In fact, there are times when I would call it a decent game, but with a mighty big asterisk. Pantheon Saga is almost a decent game if you play it on easy. Enemies go down relatively quick with your cool Hulk powers and attacks, and you can regenerate HP fast enough to not feel like you're gonna get smashed. But any higher than that, and the enemies and machines you fight become insanely unforgiving. You'll get knocked around and destroyed in seconds. Stack that together with the atrocious platforming you have to do, and the Incredible Hulk quickly goes from a hero to a zero. I mean, for example, the ice level. I have to do so many blind jumps in this section. Then you have to be extremely precise with not just your trajectory, but your speed. Whoever thought this was a good idea is a jerk. A lot of the time you'll get lost in the levels because there's specific things that it wants you to do and that might not be obvious considering, well, it tells you nothing. There's a decent bit in the manual, but near the end of the game you're supposed to interact with this computer, and the only way to do so is to pause the game, pick something from the inventory, yeah, that's an inventory by the way, make sure it's highlighted, unpause, and then press another button. Is this used anywhere else? Nope. Great classic game design. As much as this sucks to play, there is something charming about Hulk hanging around wizards and traveling through time to save the world, I think. Just be prepared for the jump scare known as the level complete screen. Jesus Christ. Wait, why does he look like Mark Cuban?
Editor's note, please use this.
Early 3D wasn't very kind to Marvel properties, especially in the mid-90s. If you weren't one of Capcom's awesome fighting games, you were probably really bad.
Sometime around the turn of the century, Marvel teamed up with Activision, and at that time, they were great at this. No matter the platform, early 2000s Marvel video games were generally pretty good. That is unless you were like Blade, but hey, a misstep or two is alright. Prior to the success of the first Spider-Man film, they made a cartoony Spider-Man game that truly felt like it was the first to capture the fun of web slinging, even if it was just shooting somewhere into the stratosphere. This is fine. Physics? F it. But at a certain point, Activision was putting out dozens of SKUs per year. Everything was on every console and every portable, which a lot of the times also meant that some of these games would end up being completely different. Same label, same exact marketing, hell, the same cover in a lot of the cases, but the game, totally different. And so that brings us to the Game Boy Advance. If you can think of a Marvel video game from the mid-2000s, there's a 9 out of 10 chance that there's a GBA port. Now, there were a few Advance exclusives, for example, Daredevil. Yeah, based off the freaking Ben Affleck film, aka my stupid 13th birthday gift that I picked. What better gift for a fresh 13-year-old child on their birthday than the 2003 adaptation of Daredevil? It took me years to try out superheroes that weren't Batman or Spider-Man after that, by the way. It's like a battle scar. Oh, and that video game, it's very, well, mid. It suffers from the same things a lot of the previous games in this video do, with weird controls, and the whole beat 'em up thing doesn't work great here, but who cares? At least we get stills from the movie with Benny A and the 20th Century Fox logo watermarking it. It's what every kid wants. Anyways, ports to the GBA at this time were almost always D-makes, and that's a staple of multi-platform games all the way to the Wii. There's always one console a slight generation behind that gotta do something with. A majority of them were side-scrolling platformers, and half of them had a lot of character and could fit in with any decent platformer from the Super Nintendo. But only one of them is so bad that it deserves the Bad Marvel Games moniker.
So let's fast forward to 2006. In my opinion, like, the tippest top of Marvel games has always been your X-Men Legends 1 and 2, and of course, Marvel Ultimate Alliance.
I remember this being a really big deal. Heck, it was one of the first games alongside, like, Gun that was a multi-plat on multiple generations. Marvel Ultimate Alliance rocked. I played the crap out of it. I didn't really play the sequel, but these days I'll still even go back to the PS4 Xbox One port that they released a couple years ago. But if you look closely at the list of releases, we've got Xbox, PC, PS2, 360, PSP, Wii, PS3, and Game Boy Advance. One of these is very not like the others. Now, the original Ultimate Alliance was developed by Raven, who are known for doing a bunch of good stuff, and they made themselves an awesome game. Heck, even the Wii and PSP ports done by Vicarious Visions hold up and are relatively impressive. The Game Boy Advance versions here were developed by a group called Barking Lizards Technology, who only ever worked on licensed games and compilations. And this is what they came up with. Yeah, that's dire. Now, I can't say that I disrespect the hustle. Marvel Ultimate Alliance for the Game Boy Advance has a ton of levels. It has a pretty decent amount of characters to pick from. There's a lot of variety in the backgrounds, and they did a decent job at making the character sprites have the same visual look that the big boy versions of the game have. The same can't be said for the music. Jank is the name of the game. Barking Lizards actually did do a lot to try and get it at the very least similar to the original, but this version is rough. Combat is a series of mashing one button to do damage, taking a bunch of hits yourself because you can't really tell, and then swapping to another character, rinse, repeat. That is, when you can actually hit the enemies because your hit detection's all over the place. It's also, frankly, awful to look at. I think a fun and bright cel-shaded look would have done wonders for this game, but the faux realistic look with the limited capabilities of the GBA just doesn't work. Considering that this version of the game got absolutely critically decimated, it seems like that's the general consensus, at least for those who know. I'd venture to say that every GBA Marvel game and port is better than this by a long shot, and you should just play one of those instead. Yes, even Daredevil. Yes, even Jessica Alba, Fantastic Four.
There's a ton of these ports that you can play, all of them with varying quality, but only one shares the same name as Marvel Ultimate Alliance and is awful. So there's like, higher expectations there. The game should have been better, but it is the worst one. So what comes after that? The world of Marvel is actually about to change with the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe thing and them being like, hey, let's make movies. That's gonna make money. So of course the video games would change with that.
Well, there was one thing prior. In 2006, Mattel decided to make a video game console and came out with the Hyperscan, a console that reads RFID chips inside of cards, and it had a total of 5 games, 3 of which were Marvel licenses: Marvel Heroes, Spiderman, and X-Men. But this is basically like the same level of quality you'd get from one of those plug and play things, which look very unfortunate. But come 2008 and everything would change. For the better, not quite. Now, to be frank, there were a few dope Marvel games in the late 2000s and early 2010s. X-Men Origins Wolverine is a fantastic action game that really resembles God of War, and it holds up today. It's no surprise it's also made by Raven. The Deadpool game isn't awful, and who could forget Marvel vs. Capcom 3? Everything else? There'd still be random Marvel cartoon and Fox movie licensed video games coming out here and there, but they weren't the main focus. That would be the Sega Marvel MCU pentology, the SMCUB. Prior to Disney making a wise business decision, Marvel had struck a deal with good old Sega to make licensed games based off of the MCU. A deal that included several developers, several movie tie-ins, and review scores way lower than their movies. Well, with the exception of Hulk and Thor. I still haven't seen Hulk, that's fine, right? And, well, that didn't last too long. I think it'd be appropriate to say that each of these sucked the big one, and it's no surprise that after the deal was done that Disney would get a bit of a stronger handle on their new IPs after the flurry of blows known as Iron Man, Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 2, Thor God of Thunder, and Captain America Super Soldier. And that's not even looking at the other side of the pond with X-Men Destiny, the last game developed by Silicon Knights and one tied up with a bunch of lawsuits and budget reductions. A bad game in its own right, but one that I think a lot of people have already talked about.
So I really want to make a video talking about Sega and Marvel's partnership and all of the games they made and all the different versions of them. I have already talked about Iron Man in the past, but I think it deserves its own video. Let me know in the comments if you think I should. But I'm not going to let this video end without talking about the worst of the bunch, Thor God of Thunder. Playable in 3D. Yeah.
Thor is a joke. There's multiple versions of this game, like we mentioned above, but the target of all the ridicule is the Xbox 360 and PS3 versions of this game that came out around the same time as the film, which was also a snoozer. Sega was going all out with these adaptations and got the 3 main cast members, Tom Hiddleston, Jamie Alexander, and Thor himself, Chris Hemsworth, to reprise their roles, even if they suck at it.
Sif.
Stupid.
God of Thunder is, well, a God of War clone. A very poor one, I might add. It's a game filled with awful camera angles. It's one that likes to stutter and freeze constantly. Frame rate? What about it? This is actually a prequel to the movie, not that anyone cares, but it's also a game that came out in 2011, the same year as Infamous 2, Uncharted 3, and Arkham City, immediately dating itself. In fact, if you look over at DC during this time period, the late 2000s are when their games started to get better. Maybe it was just Batman over and over, but still, Rocksteady killed it. Also, I have a soft spot for DC Universe Online, as that's where my username comes from. So I'm just gonna say it's good. Good game. This is my girl Eruption Shot. I thought it was just a cool Archer name and nothing else. By comparison to Arkham Asylum alone, Thor looks like a complete joke. It showed us what a developer could do with a license when they aren't just timing it out for a movie tie-in. It showed the potential of these comic book characters in the medium of video games, and best of all, it got sales. Meanwhile, on the other side of the river, Iron Man 1 for the Every Console was awarded GameSpot's Worst Use of a Great License award. Great job, Sega. In Thor, you go level to level, smashing dudes up in ugly environments while treading through sluggish cutscenes and flatly delivered dialogue from good actors. You fight enemies with cool designs, but combat devolves into the same series of events over and over. Find a baddie and smash him. If you can't smash him, use an elemental attack to destroy his armor, or hit someone from a distance with your hammer. Or if it's boss time, you just jump on them, Shadow of the Colossus style, and destroy individual pieces of their armor in like a 20-second loop. It's not fun. Everything is spongy, and combat is more of a trial of your patience and fighting with the game's performance and controls than it is skill-based. You can upgrade Thor's abilities by spending one of this number on the screen, but good luck not getting dizzy due to the fact that the entire screen shakes anytime you hit something. You'd think that if they designed the impact to do that to the screen, that you wouldn't be fighting massive sponges, but hey, this is a video called Bad Marvel Games. This all repeats for like 5 or 6 hours before you hit the credits, and call it a day. There's unlockable costumes, and it seems like it wants you to play it more than once since you unlock new effect colors and new Game Plus style upgrades, but I don't know why anyone would do that. Thor: God of Thunder is easily one of the worst Marvel games out there, and it's no surprise that Sega lost the right to these hot movie properties. I just shudder thinking about what Sega's Avengers would have looked like, and they probably would have done it too. I'm gonna come back to this specific topic another time, but for now, I guess that's all she wrote. Once Disney took over, the quality control went up several notches, but I guess that's just what happens when you hit up Insomniac and more trusted developers. Beautiful arm hair.
That's all I got for today. Now, I know I probably missed some stuff, and you're gonna let me know in the comments, and, go ahead and do it. I would love to check. Well, I don't know about love. By the way, if I hear anyone say that Avengers is bad after I played all of that, I swear. Anyways, I've been Austin, and catch me next time when I talk about that Dragon Ball Z Kakarot game that I've been saying I'm gonna talk about. It got updated. What am I supposed to do? They updated it after the script was done. I have to do it.
Thank you so much for watching. Special Patreon shout out to Blackfoot Ferret, Brandon Howell, Chris Shelton, Christopher Olivia, Darren Newton, DX Buster, David Molnar, GM Pinks, Irrational, Jay Roos, Jacoby Fitzpatrick, Jordy McCaffrey, Kevin Zanowski, Kieran Arter, Nick Irving, P Funk, Randall Bentley, and Ryan Talbert. Thank you so much for your generous support. So we had a bit of a video gap, but here's the plan. One video every week for the rest of the year. It's gonna happen. If you did like this video, make sure to check out my Patreon, patreon.com/Austin Eruption, and help the channel out. It helps me get these things out faster, and it's appreciated quite a bit. Anyway, I'm gonna go. I got to finish that Kakarot video. It's so close. I'm sorry.